Okay. I will get started. First of all, thank you so much for coming on and agreeing to come on to this webinar. It's personally very gratifying to me that you would take the time out of your busy schedule to join in. And again, kind of the purpose here is to invite you, the key stakeholders and decision makers at your respective firms in involving what's commonly called business process outsourcing, to participate really in a roundtable discussion where I'm going to have some slides to talk about certain things, but I'm trying to, my goal is to make this as interactive as possible in somewhat of an informal manner. I'm going to moderate and gain your valuable input and participation and all. So again, thank you so much for attending. It's very meaningful for me and to take time out of your busy days. Just brief introductions. You all know myself. I've been an industry consultant for about 15 years now, helping law firms primarily negotiating their RFP, outsourcing contracts, and project managing these somewhat unwieldy processes, and trying to arrive at a solution that is a win-win for the client and vendor. Having come from the vendor industry, I've always felt that a win client-vendor relationship and is really the best suited as all. With us today, I know we have Jane Ann Gorman, who's Executive Director from Wilkinson Barker in DC. Jane Ann, welcome.
Thank you.
Right now we have Holly Evers, Director of Facilities at Foley Hoag up in Boston. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you.
Glad to see the Red Sox have finally won a few games recently.
Yes.
And we have Andrea Lewis, who's the Facilities and Business Services Manager up at Varela Braun and Martel in San Francisco. Hi, Andrea.
Hi, everyone.
Okay. And possibly joining us will be John Rezzo, the Director of IT at Snell Wilmer, a large national law firm with its headquarters in Phoenix, Arizona. John's the Director of IT, but facilities, office services, and business process really falls under his cap. So hopefully John will be able to make it. So what I plan on sort of covering in my PowerPoint today, from a topical standpoint, is some of the latest trends, outsourcing, in particular with the tendency these days, especially for consultant-led RFPs, towards predominantly price-driven resolutions. And by the way, after each section, I have some questions that I'd like to throw out to one or more of you, or whoever has a viewpoint or wants to chip in, again, to try to keep this, really as interactive as possible. We'll talk a little bit about co-sourcing, legal process outsourcing, possibly how to reconcile the desire to cut costs, reduce expenses without impacting the service levels, to diminish service volumes. We all know that, mail fax copy volumes are down significantly than they were 5 years ago. Does that also mean that the importance of these services are similarly diminished? And then finally, what's next for legal outsourcing, where we'll talk about some of the new areas that are going to be looked at for outsourcing. As kind of a lead up to this presentation, I had a chance to speak with 3 of the primary service providers and their leadership, outsourcing providers, to specifically gain some background on what they see as some of the legal outsourcing trends, as well as some of their challenges, and as well as how their organizations, what they're looking to really offer in outsourcing moving forward, because as we all know, the traditional business process outsourcing areas have kind of tabled off or leveled off as you know, these services have diminished, or the headcounts have diminished, or the number of copiers, et cetera, have diminished. But the industry as itself finds itself in a situation where it's trying to broaden its offerings, and law firms in parallel are trying to look at other outsourcing opportunities to remain competitive. And then finally, if there's any open topics you want to suggest, we can talk about. In fairness, each one of these sections could take up its own seminar or its own webinar, so we're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on them. I try to cover as much ground, I guess, in this initial presentation and seminar webinar, so that we cover a lot of things, and future webinars may be a little bit more narrow in focus. So some of the trends that I've written about recently on my blog, on my website, have not been all that promising for legal business process outsourcing, especially for the suppliers. And what I mean by that is, lately, particularly with national law firms who are in the process of consolidating services, vendors, you know, reducing headcount through assimilation, et cetera, there's been a much more numbers-oriented approach to the services through these largely consultant-led RFP processes. And even in certain circumstances, what I would call uneven competitive bidding tactics used by some consultants that drive the prices downward for the services, and as well as margins for the providers. Things like in the old days, when you had a bidding, what's called a competitive bidding process, you might throw out the highest vendor and the lowest vendor in terms of a price perspective. You know, that's a simple core procurement process and fundamental. But nowadays, the lowball bidder is often being used as the benchmark to come back to the other providers to reduce their numbers, even though we all know a lowball bidder often is not necessarily a valid bid to begin with. And I've even seen some situations where an incumbent provider lost the business in a RFP process, where a competing vendor essentially hired most or all of their surviving staff, but they had to cut employee salaries and benefits in order to save the client money, basically to meet the savings objectives that the RFP consultant came up with. And many times these savings projections are somewhat arbitrary. Consultants come in saying, we can save you 20% on your current contract. And, you know, of course, anything is possible, but the real question is, what does that really mean to the services and or the employees? So the impact of these primarily cost-driven RFP processes really treat the services more as a commodity. And as I mentioned earlier, according to the industry, it's resulting in single-digit profit margins by some vendors. Some of this is out of necessity, where unless they reduce their profit margins, they won't be able to retain the business. I'm talking about incumbents. But the problem with that is these single-digit profit margins, or these price-driven RFP processes, don't really take into account that the overhead costs that are baked into a supplier's P&L, such as their subject matter expertise, their value-added services, their overhead of area managers and management, employee training programs, et cetera, which largely law firms still kind of expect, but, you know, it's difficult to reconcile that with single-digit profit margins. I mean, imagine what it would be like at your law firm if it operated under single-digit profit margins. I mean, what would the impact be on wages, benefits, or even to your culture? And how about things like even productivity and morale? So it's really no different for the outsourcing providers in a lot of ways. And in fact, the outsourcing vendor community is really up in arms against some of these consultants who the providers are claiming are actually hurting the business by increasing expectations that are unattainable, and again, driving down profit margins that make providing the services almost unattainable. And it's also even led some business process outsourcing providers to have to resort to deploying temporary workers for their on-site outsourced operations to remain competitive. And we all know that that traditionally covers a whole host of issues compared to permanent dedicated employee training, retention, continuity, et cetera. So some questions that I'd like to throw out to you folks. Most of you have recently undergone either a contract extension with your incumbent or maybe an RFP to refresh the services. And most of you have actually used consultants in the past or done the work in-house. What would you say were your primary objectives in your recent contract renegotiation or RFP bid? If you don't mind, I'll just maybe pick on somebody. I guess I'll play school teacher. Andrea, what would you say your objectives were in your recent renegotiation with your provider?
Well, we wanted to make sure that we were getting a competitive rate to what the industry was charging at the time. But I've certainly never been interested in the real lowball approach, because I have heard that sometimes that can really backfire, and so I compare the figures with what it would cost for us to do this ourselves and bring the staffing back in and get some sort of benchmark that way. Well, okay, is this somewhat reasonable? Does it seem like it's in line, and that type of thing.
Okay. Holly, I know you recently also went through a contract renegotiation using a consultant actually for your incumbent provider. I guess, what were some of your objectives, and did you achieve all of your objectives, by not necessarily going out to bid?
Yeah, I think our general objectives were to reduce costs, and we had cut staff kind of regularly over like 5 or 6 years, and the fact is a lot of the volumes continue to decline.
Right.
Our hours have declined to the point that we used to be open until midnight, and people were usually here until 3 in the morning doing work. Then we closed at 10, and we further cut back till 8. And we reduced our Saturdays. So our goal was to lower costs really by eliminating 3 more positions.
Okay.
And yes, we did achieve that, and all of our services did remain the same after some of the changes that we made, which included reduced mail runs, shorter hours, and not working on Saturdays.
So you opted to scale down based on the needs of the firm, and of course that typically translates into headcount reductions. Was the
correct.
vendor and the vendor ultimately, obviously this was a solution that they were a partner in and probably had to acknowledge. Did the end result end up being fair to both sides, do you think?
Yes, it was, and they were the ones who actually had made the recommendations of what we could do to achieve being able to reduce the staffing without reducing the services. Right.
Okay. And Jane Ann, I know you obviously went through a process about 2 years ago and ended up changing vendors as well on your side. So I surmise you met all of your objectives and things have worked out for both sides?
They really have. I mean, our concern was that we had been with the prior service provider for 10 years and it had gotten expensive and the service had declined. So we were really looking for 2 things. We weren't specifically price driven, although price was important, but having good service was equally as important as we went through the process and evaluated the bidders.
Okay. And just if any of you, I think I know, I know all of you well, and how you value the outsourcing provider personnel. So I would imagine you would not consider a temporary workforce as a potential solution to saving money. Is that correct for all of you?
That's correct.
That's correct for me.
Yes.
Okay, terrific. Let's talk a little bit about co-sourcing. Co-sourcing is on the rise per one blog that was written from today. Co-sourcing is where you source out certain positions where manpower needs may be a little bit more variable, and you retain the supervision or some higher skill sets in-house that essentially oversee these areas. It's frankly never been that widespread used in the business process outsourcing area. Theory being it's easier for outsourcing providers than in-house to ramp up or down more easily, saving firm money. It is also known as out-tasking. And again, it's less used on the BPO side, and perhaps used more in other areas. And I have a reference to a blog here where I'll publish that to everybody after the call. Has anyone had any experience without tasking or post-sourcing?
We have not.
Okay.
I think our firm may have, if I understand this correctly, which would be on the attorney side, where they have a big case come in and they hire some contract attorneys, and they come in and they either work on site or they work off site, and then when that project is done, then they leave.
Yeah, that's correct, Andrea. I've only known of a couple instances where it's been used in the business process area, and you're right. It was either typically used to backfill as permanent employees turned over or retired, or to ramp up for something that's more of a temporary base. Let's talk a little bit about legal process outsourcing. Become much more extensively pursued in legal. It's actually supported by the ABA as far back as 2008 when it published its formal opinion 08451. This is an opinion that supports that outsourcing of legal procedures is okay, even if it's offshore, and that the outsourcing trend is a salutary one for our globalized economy. Kind of big words, but I guess what it's saying is that it's a necessary pursuit in order to remain competitive these days in the global economy. The ABA outlines steps that law firms can actually take to ensure it has met the ethical and legal obligations for its clients in terms of compliance and many things that are usually red lights for outsourcing, particularly when you're talking about legal proceedings. And of course, these issues must be closely monitored by firms, and full disclosure must be provided to clients, as well as cost savings that are enjoyed by the law firms passed on to clients. And again, there's a blog which I'd be glad to send to you. For any of you, has your firm made it a point to look for more opportunities to outsource legal processes? And if so, why would that be?
We have not at Wilkinson.
Okay.
Foley has not either.
Okay. All right. Some other trends that I wanted to point out with the contraction or reduction of traditional mail, fax, copy, labor, and equipment provisions, business process outsourcers are now trying to broaden their offerings into other areas beyond the traditional, such as IT help desk, e-discovery, both paper and electronic based, as well as many other types of legal services, such as contract attorneys, legal training, conference centers. Additionally, secretarial support, records management are now being predominantly looked at. These are kind of ancillary services in addition to the traditional business process. Even outsourcing providers are even considering accounts payable as a possible outsourcing provision. because many of these providers, in fact, most of them acknowledge that the traditional revenue base from what used to be called in the industry bodies and boxes are over, and they must be able to provide more consultative services. Because what it really comes down to is law firms are looking to convert what used to be fixed costs into variable costs, which allow them to scale up and scale down dynamically instead of just paying for permanent overhead. Some questions. Start with you, maybe Holly. Is your firm looking at all these additional outsourcing opportunities with your provider, or assessing if that would be relevant to your firm?
Not with our current provider, no. I've heard considerations of some of those areas with other providers, but not with our the office services provider.
Okay. Anyone else?
We currently outsource our help desk and and some of our IT network maintenance capabilities, but we don't do that with our current outsourcing provider. We use two different IT providers for those services. I've been pitched on some of the things you've mentioned by our current provider and others, but they haven't been something that we've really been interested in taking any action on.
Right. In practicality, and I mentioned this on a further slide, particularly in the area of lit support, and certainly contract attorneys and the like, it requires a significant investment and available expertise and capability by sourcing provider. It's really a significant financial investment that they have to make, and there's probably only realistically 2 or 3 providers out there that have made that investment and built, the necessary network for these kinds of things.
We've done a little bit of working with our provider to provide reception backup, and that's been helpful because you know what that's like, trying to get a temp to cover your reception desk.
Right, that's always a huge challenge. Okay. I think we talked a bit about, cost savings and as a consequence of shrinking volumes and services, and how, in spite of the seemingly all-out war on cost in some of these projects, that it's tough for the outsourcing providers to compete when their costs, like anyone else's, are going up, and so forth. And a valid question for many firms is how far are they willing to go to reduce service levels to save money? In some cases, it makes sense, as you alluded to, Holly. Simply cutting hours and cutting mail sweeps to reflect the the kind of normalcy of the services is really what's being done in your case. So we talked a little bit about the concept of cost reduction and affecting services. So I'm going to kind of move through this because I think all of you have a recognition that whatever the service levels you do arrive at in your renewal or in an RFP process, they're still important to the firm. In effect, to be maintained. Would that be a correct statement?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. And again, I've had a question with a number of administrators that I've talked to that, process volumes are way down, in some cases 80%, fax all but disappeared. Traditional copy, paper-based document management services, even scanning, have really diminished dramatically. Even decentralized scanning and copying, printing volumes are way down as more and more documents come in digitally. Today, there's an increased focus on document scanning, but from a records perspective, not just a central document management perspective, as more and more documents exist digitally only, or if they are paper-based, rather than sending them to an offsite record storage, you scan them, digitize them, and destroy them right on the premises, something I'll get into in a moment. One question I know we're kind of getting at the bottom of the half hour here, and I want to be mindful of your time. But one question is, how has the perceived importance of these services changed in recent years, in spite of the decreased volumes? Would you say that the services are just as important in spite of the volumes diminishing?
Definitely, yes.
I get lots of comments from people who are so thankful that when they go down the copy center, there's cheerful people doing a good job and getting them out of a rush situation. So I think they are really important.
And Jane Ann, I know you feel the same way, in spite of the fact. Okay.
There hasn't been a lot of pressure on me to try to squeeze every nickel out of these contracts. They do want to make sure that our staffing is right, and I have no incentive not to right size the staffing when I can. So that's what's, I think, the benefit of outsourcing. You can just tell them, hey, we don't need 10 people anymore, we need 9, and they just take care of it, and it's pretty stress-free. So that's what I see, one of the biggest benefits of outsourcing.
That's very well put, and that's often what's cited as a key reason to outsource. Okay, I want to wrap up just by kind of touching on what's next for legal outsourcing, and may have actually alluded to, some of the things in terms of what additional services will be looked at. And from the vendor perspective, they're always trying to act as consultants to the law firms to advise them what should be being looked at. And I know one prominent outsourcer has actually changed what they call these services now to what's called managed services. And that's kind of a corporate term that's been more predominant in recent years as it pertains to corporate travel, procurement, and other business process services, all of which have become outsourced more and more readily, particularly in the corporate environment. I think that may be a trend you'll see in the future. The old facilities management services, I think, is probably going to go by the wayside in lieu of a managed services type approach. And a real opportunity for law firms in terms of saving costs via outsourcing is certainly looking at other services. And records management in particular seems to be one that's gotten predominant focus and attention. And that would be when combined with an enterprise scanning solution. And what that essentially means is the provider not only takes over the managed service element of your records management program, but they also implement an enterprise level scanning operation that it allows a law firm in the future to have boxes of files come in from cases, rather than send them to your offsite record storage company, to scan them, destroy them locally, and they never make it to offsite storage, and they're converted to a digital document platform maintained on site, making it easier to locate, and rather than go through paper boxes right. So in essence, law firms have to be a little bit more open-minded to paying more for the upfront scanning costs, but see the eventual cost savings down the road that they're going to recognize by reducing their offsite storage costs, as well as the greater efficiencies of being able to search on the files more readily. And again, you know, a lot of the vendors community is saying there's no real savings anymore to realize through BPO services, other than what Holly explained, where you're actually changing the service levels or the service and reducing headcount and cost in that respect. Many of your outsourcing firms say after 2 or 3 iterations of RFPs and consulting projects, there's not a lot more to draw on. But they maintain in the future, in the next couple of years, law firms, in order to remain competitive, are going to have to start looking at other areas than traditional business process outsourcing. Areas like word processing, legal assistance, litigation support services, managed document review, along with records management, even secretarial services, should all be looked at for outsourcing opportunities. And again, the reason for that is not only to remove headcount, but to convert a lot of these fixed costs to variable costs. Where an outsourcing provider can again scale up or scale down depending on the needs, and you only pay for what you use as opposed to permanent hires. And as I mentioned before, the investment that's really needed and the expertise level really kind of pull this off from an outsourcing provider perspective is really only 2 or 3 players out there that have made that kind of investment. And these are your GTIs, you know, the real top tier outsourcing providers. Right now, many law firms are considering these approaches. You know, the real question is, will they actually pull the trigger in the coming years? And a lot of people feel that they really must, you know, in order to stay competitive, because the legal landscaping in particular is having a lot of price pressure driven by your clients, you know, through legal project management, which is converting what used to be time and material based pricing structure in certain matters and tasks to now becoming fixed price, even where a law firm client will bid them out to other vendors to reduce costs and overhead. And these approaches are not just for the large corporate-run national firms. They definitely apply to small and medium-sized firms as well. And perhaps even more because those size firms may not have the in-house resources or expertise or technology that the bigger players have. So I guess one quick final run of questions before we wrap up. And basically, you know, again, from your knowledge standpoint, what do you see as a changing landscape in terms of what the service providers are offering, as well as what your firm is considering to outsource? I guess, Jane Ann, we can start with you and maybe go around the horn.
I'm not sure that we're really, you know, considering outsourcing anything else at this point. We have, as I say that though, we have hired a few contract lawyers because of work volumes, but that's really about as far as I think we're really going to go at this point.
Right. Okay, Holly, how about Foley Hoag?
With our current provider, one of the only things that we've talked about, but I don't know where it'll go, is scanning documents, trying to reduce what we send off site and trying to scan that in-house, but I really don't know where that'll go at this point.
Okay. Thank you. Andrea?
I don't know of any changes right now. I know people are aware that other options exist, but no one's pursued an interest in that at this time that I know of.
Well, what's basically being said is you know, that at most of your firms, obviously the people at the executive director or C-level are the ones who likely are being you know, bombarded with these trends and trying to get their arms around how to move forward, or if there is forward at the firms versus the partnership. So But you know, this is basically what's out there and in the direction that the industry providers are saying will be out there in 2 to 4 years. I know we're a little bit over, and again, I thank you so much for coming by and participating. Does anyone have any questions or any topic you'd like to throw out? Or maybe what we'll do is, I intend to do these about early, and would love to have all of you back. And I'm certainly going to send out a follow-up to get your feedback and, you know, to get your very frank comments on how this went and how it can go better, and you know, whether this was really helpful or meaningful, or even what topics you'd like to discuss going in the future. So again, thank you so much for attending. It means a lot to me. I know all of you personally, and have had the pleasure of working with you on various projects. Hopefully will in the future. And again, I'll be in touch, and if you have other colleagues that you want to invite to future webinars, that would be wonderful. And as well as I'll kind of ask you for a list of topics you might want to cover, so we can those in future webinars. So again, thank you all very, very much. I'm very grateful. And, again, thank you for the time, and I'll be in touch out there. I think if you haven't gathered by now, I'm trying to be kind of a different voice in the outsourcing consulting space, I think, than some of my competitors. I think